A black businesswoman was eagerly heading to her first major international presentation. A moment she had worked tirelessly to achieve. But when she stepped into the first-class cabin of her flight, everything took a turn. A dismissive flight attendant treated her with quiet hostility, ignoring her requests and humiliating her in subtle but undeniable ways. Just 10 minutes later, the airline's CEO stepped in. And what happened next left the entire plane stunned and sparked a series of events that no one could have predicted. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that challenge and inspire. The airport shimmered in the early morning light, a sea of polished tile and glass that seemed to stretch endlessly. Camille Johnson walked briskly through the terminal, her leather carry-on brushing lightly against her side. Her tailored navy suit hugged her frame, a silk scarf tied neatly at her neck, an ensemble that spoke of confidence, professionalism, and success. She carried herself with purpose, her sharp heels clicking against the tiled floor like a steady metronome. And yet, even as she strode with certainty, she felt it, the weight. It was subtle, like an itch beneath the skin. A sensation not loud enough to demand attention but persistent enough to remind her it was there. It began at security, where the agent's eyes lingered on her a fraction too long as he scanned her ID. The pause before he waved her through felt heavy with unspoken questions. Why are you here? What's your story? Camille ignored it. She had long learned to brush aside the small slights, the moments that weren't large enough to spark outrage but sharp enough to sting. As she neared her gate, the familiar murmurs of travel surrounded her, the voices of announcements crackling over the speakers, the low hum of conversation, the impatient tapping of fingers against carry-ons. At gate 14, she joined the line for first-class passengers, the shorter queue a small reward for her years of hard work. The man ahead of her in a gray pinstripe suit offered his ticket to the gate agent, who greeted him with a rehearsed smile. When it was Camille's turn, the smile flickered. It wasn't obvious, not enough for a confrontation, but the shift in tone was unmistakable. The gate agent hesitated as he scanned her boarding pass, his brow furrowing briefly before he quickly handed it back. "Enjoy your flight," he said, his voice polite but distant, the warmth from the previous exchange noticeably absent. Camille murmured her thanks and moved down the jet bridge, her grip tightening on the leather strap of her bag. She focused on the rhythmic sound of her heels against the metal floor. "Don't let it get to you," she told herself. Not today. The plane's interior was a pristine expanse of leather seats and soft lighting, the promise of comfort and luxury for the hours ahead. A flight attendant greeted her at the door with a perfunctory, "Welcome aboard," her eyes darting briefly to Camille's bag before she turned away without another word. Camille nodded and moved toward her seat, 3A, a window seat in first class. As she settled in, Camille felt the faintest prickle of unease. It was the kind of unease that couldn't be pinned to one thing but rather a collection of small moments. The sidelong glances as she walked through the terminal, the hesitation of the gate agent, the cool indifference of the flight attendant, each moment small enough to brush aside. But together they formed a pattern she recognized all too well. The cabin began to fill with passengers, their conversations blending into a quiet hum. Camille turned to the window, watching the ground crew move with mechanical efficiency below. She had always loved this part of flying, the brief stillness before takeoff, the sense of anticipation. But today, the stillness felt heavy. The first-class cabin was a study in unspoken contrasts. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored suit reviewed spreadsheets on his tablet, his champagne glass already glinting on his tray. Behind her, a couple in matching leisurewear laughed softly, their voices mingling with the faint clink of glasses. The flight attendants moved with practiced grace, pouring drinks, exchanging pleasantries, their smiles wide and easy. Except when it came to Camille. She waited patiently, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Time passed. The man across the aisle received a second pour of champagne, his glass refilled with a warm smile. The couple behind her asked for extra napkins, their request met with cheerful efficiency. Camille pressed the call button, the soft chime cutting through the cabin. Lisa Marlowe, a flight attendant with crisp auburn hair and a name tag that gleamed under the cabin lights, appeared at her row. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Could I have some water, please?" Camille asked, keeping her voice steady. Lisa's eyes flicked to the untouched glasses of champagne on the trays around her. "We'll be serving drinks shortly," she replied curtly, then turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Camille sat back, her composure unbroken but her resolve sharpening. These moments of quiet dismissal, of being made to feel as though she didn't belong, were as familiar as they were exhausting. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But today, she decided, she wouldn't let it slide. Outside the window, the sun was rising higher, painting the clouds in hues of gold and pink. It was beautiful, Camille thought, but it was also a reminder. Beauty and tension could exist side by side. And as the engines roared to life, Camille knew the real turbulence was yet to come. The plane taxied smoothly along the runway, the familiar hum of the engines growing louder as the flight prepared for takeoff. Camille Johnson leaned back in her seat, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. She watched the clouds through the window, trying to lose herself in their soft, sprawling expanse. Yet, even as she sought refuge in the sky, the tension in the cabin seemed to tighten around her like an invisible net. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the first-class cabin, their polished smiles and crisp uniforms radiating a practiced professionalism. Camille observed them as they poured glasses of champagne, adjusted blankets, and handed out menus with warmth and attentiveness, warmth that seemed to skip over her entirely. She told herself to wait. Be patient, she thought. Surely, they would come to her soon. But the minutes dragged on, and Camille remained an island of isolation amid the tide of service that swirled around her. When the pre-departure drink cart finally reached her row, Lisa Marlowe was at the helm. The name tag pinned to her uniform caught the cabin lights, flashing briefly like a warning. Lisa moved with precision, offering each passenger a choice of drinks, her voice light and pleasant. But when she reached Camille, her tone flattened, her movements stiffened. "Would you like anything, ma'am?" Lisa asked, her eyes skimming past Camille as though she wasn't fully there. "Just water, please," Camille replied. Lisa's hand hovered over the cart for a moment too long, and Camille thought she saw the faintest flicker of hesitation before the attendant poured the water into a plastic cup and placed it on the tray table without a word. No napkin, no eye contact, just the water, as though that alone fulfilled the bare minimum of her obligation. "Thank you," Camille said quietly, more out of habit than genuine gratitude. Lisa didn't respond. Instead, she turned to the next row, her voice lifting once more into pleasantries as she asked a man in a tailored suit if he would like a refill of champagne. It was subtle, so subtle, Camille thought, that no one else in the cabin might have noticed. But Camille noticed. She always noticed. She had learned to read these moments with the precision of a scholar dissecting text, uncovering meaning in the smallest gestures, the tiniest inflections. These moments were never loud enough to echo, but they left their mark just the same, like a shadow that lingered long after the sun had set. The plane ascended into the sky, the seatbelt sign blinking off with a soft chime. Camille opened her laptop, deciding to focus on her work. The slide deck for her presentation glowed on the screen, the neat bullet points offering a sense of control that felt distant in this cabin. She immersed herself in her task, taking notes, tweaking phrasing, and reminding herself that this trip was about more than the small indignities she had endured so far. But the unease refused to fade. As the meal service began, Camille once again found herself at the edge of attentiveness. Lisa moved through the cabin with practiced ease, her voice ringing warmly as she addressed each passenger by name. When it was Camille's turn, the warmth disappeared. "Salmon or chicken?" Lisa asked brusquely, not bothering to meet Camille's eyes. "I'll have the salmon," Camille replied, her tone calm. Lisa jotted down the order without acknowledgement, pivoting quickly to the next passenger. The man across the aisle ordered the same dish and received a cheerful, "Excellent choice, sir." In response, Camille felt the weight of the imbalance like a stone in her chest. She wasn't asking for special treatment, just equal treatment, simple dignity, extended to all. But dignity, it seemed, was as unevenly distributed as the champagne in first class. When the meal arrived, Camille noticed another slight, small but deliberate. Her tray was set down with less care than those around her. The napkin was askew, the utensils misaligned. To anyone else, it might have looked like an oversight, a minor mistake, but Camille knew better. These weren't accidents, they were messages. Whispered through action instead of words. She glanced at Lisa as the attendant walked away. Her steps brisk and purposeful. Camille wondered what it was that had hardened Lisa's demeanor toward her. Was it her presence in first class? Her professional confidence? Or was it simply her existence? A fact that Lisa could not reconcile with the image of who belonged in this space. Camille decided she had had enough. She pressed the call button again, watching as Lisa appeared with a clipped expression, her professional mask faltering just slightly. "Yes, ma'am?" Lisa asked, her tone teetering on the edge of impatience. Camille folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Is there a reason I seem to be receiving a different level of service than the other passengers?" The question was straightforward, yet its weight hung in the air between them like a challenge. Lisa blinked, momentarily thrown off balance, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said, the words empty and perfunctory. "We're treating all passengers equally." Camille tilted her head, her gaze steady and unyielding. "Are you?" Lisa glanced around the cabin, clearly aware that other passengers were listening. Her posture stiffened, and her voice grew defensive. "If you're unhappy, ma'am, you're welcome to file a complaint." Camille's lips curved into a faint, cold smile. "Perhaps I will." Lisa turned on her heel and walked away, her movements sharper now, the crack in her professional composure widening. Camille sat back in her seat, her heartbeat steady but her resolve stronger than ever. She knew this wasn't over, not for her. And not for Lisa. The quiet turbulence of the plane's engines filled the cabin. But the real turbulence was simmering just below the surface. For Camille, this wasn't just about water, or napkins, or tone. It was about something much larger. Something insidious that seeped into spaces where it was never welcome but always present. The fight wasn't loud yet, but it was building, gaining momentum like the rising altitude. Camille could feel it in the air. The storm was coming. The cabin had settled into an uneasy rhythm, the quiet punctuated by the faint clinking of utensils and the murmur of conversation. Camille Johnson sat in her seat, her posture straight but unyielding, a quiet storm brewing within her. She felt the shift in energy around her, subtle but perceptible. Passengers stole glances her way, their curiosity barely concealed, while Lisa Marlowe and her colleague, Jeff Wallace, exchanged whispers near the galley. Camille wasn't a stranger to the dynamics of discomfort. She knew the choreography well, the quiet glances exchanged like a secret code, the hushed tones that carried meaning even without words. It was a dance she had seen play out countless times before. In boardrooms, hotel lobbies, and now, at 35,000 feet. The tension crystallized as dessert was served. Camille watched as Lisa approached the row across from hers, her demeanor warm and attentive. A young couple seated there laughed softly as Lisa placed their desserts before them with a practiced flourish, adding a bright, "Enjoy," before moving on. When Lisa reached Camille's row, her energy shifted. She set the dessert down with mechanical precision, her face devoid of the easy charm she had just displayed. No eye contact, no acknowledgement. The contrast wasn't just glaring, it was deliberate. Camille felt it as clearly as if Lisa had spoken the slight aloud. "Thank you," Camille said pointedly, her voice calm but edged with steel. Lisa gave a perfunctory nod and turned away without a word, her back stiff as she moved down the aisle. It wasn't just the service that gnawed at Camille, it was the ripple effect it created. The man across the aisle, who had earlier given her a supportive nod, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding her gaze. A few rows behind, a pair of passengers whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward Camille as though she were the anomaly disrupting their tranquil flight. The weight of their stares bore down on her. She thought of all the times she had been made to feel this way, an unspoken question hanging in the air. "Why are you here?" It wasn't a question of geography but of belonging, an insidious doubt cast on her right to occupy certain spaces. It wasn't new, but it never stopped being exhausting. Lisa and Jeff lingered in the galley, their conversation growing increasingly animated. Camille caught snippets of their hushed tones as they occasionally glanced her way. Jeff's posture was defensive, his arms crossed over his chest, while Lisa's hands gestured sharply, her frustration evident. "She's just being difficult," Lisa muttered, her voice carrying just enough for Camille to catch the words. Jeff sighed, his tone low but firm. "You need to let it go. It's not worth it. Camille turned her attention back to her laptop. But the words wouldn't leave her. Difficult. How easily it was used to deflect. To shift blame from the aggressor to the aggrieved. The label was a weapon, designed to undermine her dignity without ever confronting her directly. She closed her laptop and leaned back, her thoughts racing. She could feel the narrative being written around her, an invisible script that painted her as the problem. But Camille refused to let others define her story. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom with an update on their arrival time. Camille barely registered his words, her focus shifting to the movement near the galley. Lisa was speaking with another passenger, a man in his 40s dressed in business casual. Camille noticed how Lisa's posture softened, her smile returning as she laughed lightly at something he said. The interaction struck a chord in Camille not because it was particularly egregious, but because it was so achingly familiar. The ease with which Lisa slipped into warmth and attentiveness for some passengers while freezing others out was a stark reminder of how prejudice often operated, not in overt acts, but in subtle exclusions, in the spaces where care was withheld. Determined not to let the flight pass without addressing the issue, Camille pressed the call button once more. This time, Jeff appeared. His expression was carefully neutral, but the tension in his posture betrayed his discomfort. "Yes, ma'am?" he asked. Camille regarded him for a moment, her gaze steady. "I'd like to speak with the senior flight attendant. Please." Jeff hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Is there something I can assist you with?" "I'd prefer to speak with her directly," Camille said, her tone unwavering. Jeff nodded curtly and disappeared into the galley. Moments later, Lisa returned, her expression carefully composed but her eyes carrying a flicker of annoyance. "Yes, ma'am?" Lisa asked, her tone clipped. Camille met her gaze head-on. "I've noticed a distinct difference in the way I've been treated compared to other passengers. I'd like to understand why that is." Lisa blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said, the same hollow refrain as before. "We're treating all passengers equally." "Are you?" Camille asked, her voice calm but pointed. "Because that hasn't been my experience." Lisa's cheeks flushed, and for a moment, her composure cracked. She glanced toward the galley, as though seeking backup. "I assure you, ma'am, we're doing our best." Camille tilted her head slightly. "Then perhaps your best needs improvement." The silence that followed was deafening. Passengers in nearby rows shifted in their seats, their ears straining to catch the exchange. Lisa straightened her posture, her professional mask slipping back into place. "If there's anything specific you need, ma'am, I'd be happy to assist," Lisa said, her tone icy. "What I need," Camille replied, her voice steady, "is respect, and so far, I haven't received it." Lisa opened her mouth to respond but thought better of it. She turned and walked away, her steps hurried and her shoulders rigid. Camille exhaled slowly, her hands resting on the armrests. She wasn't seeking a dramatic confrontation, but she also refused to let the moment pass unchallenged. She knew that the fight wasn't just for her, it was for everyone who had ever felt the weight of being dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel small. As the plane sailed through the sky, Camille felt the storm within her settle, not with resignation, but with clarity. The battle wasn't over, but she had drawn her line in the sand, and she wasn't moving. The cabin, once a haven of quiet luxury, now simmered with an unspoken tension. Camille Johnson sat upright in her seat, her presence a quiet assertion of her dignity amidst the turmoil. The soft hum of the engines filled the space, but it was no longer enough to muffle the undercurrent of unease. People were watching her now, not openly, but through furtive glances, stolen sideways looks, and the sharp silence that seemed to trail behind Lisa Marlowe whenever she passed Camille's row. Camille, outwardly poised, felt the weight of those eyes. They were spectators, complicit in their silence, as if the discomfort was hers alone to resolve. It was a familiar isolation one she had encountered at corporate meetings where her expertise was questioned, in restaurants where servers assumed she didn't belong. And now, here in the curated space of first-class air travel, Lisa and Jeff stood near the galley, their conversation hushed but urgent. Camille could see them through the gap in the curtain that separated first class from economy. Lisa's hands moved in sharp, anxious gestures, while Jeff's arms remained folded across his chest, his brow furrowed in quiet frustration. Camille couldn't hear their words, But she didn't need to. Their body language spoke volumes. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about them, about the discomfort she had introduced by refusing to shrink, by refusing to quietly accept the subtle slights and indignities. Her call button, her questions, her presence, it had unsettled something in them, and they were scrambling to restore the balance of their carefully controlled world. The next escalation came quietly. Almost imperceptibly, Lisa approached Camille's row again, this time carrying a tray of coffee. The cups rattled softly as she set one down on Camille's tray table. Camille glanced at the cup, noticing immediately that it was different from the others she had seen served. No saucer, no napkin, and the cup itself was chipped at the rim. "Thank you," Camille said, her voice even, though her pulse quickened. She didn't touch the coffee. Lisa hesitated, as though expecting her to say more. When Camille didn't, Lisa turned abruptly and walked away, her shoulders tense. Camille stared at the chipped cup for a moment, the small imperfection seeming to loom larger and larger in her mind. It wasn't just a cup, it was a message. An extension of the same dismissiveness she had felt since the moment she boarded. A deliberate omission, a quiet declaration that her presence was tolerated, not welcomed. The other passengers had noticed by now. Camille could see it in their shifting postures, their hesitant glances. The man across the aisle, salt and pepper hair, a tablet balanced on his lap, offered her a faint, apologetic smile. It was an attempt at solidarity. But Camille didn't return it. She didn't need their pity, she needed them to understand. A flight attendant, a younger woman with nervous hands and a face that betrayed her unease, approached to collect the tray. "Did you need anything else, ma'am?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. Camille looked up at her, studying her face. The girl was trying, but her attempt felt half-hearted, driven more by guilt than genuine care. "No, thank you," Camille replied, her tone measured. The young woman nodded quickly and disappeared. Her footsteps hurried. Meanwhile, in economy, a man in an aisle seat sat quietly, observing, dressed in jeans and a blazer. He blended in with the other passengers, his demeanor unassuming, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. Raymond Carter, the airline's CEO, had been watching from the moment Camille boarded. He had seen the hesitation at the gate, the subtle shifts in the flight attendant's demeanor, the way Lisa's warmth evaporated whenever she spoke to Camille. He had witnessed enough to feel a growing knot of disappointment in his chest. This wasn't the airline he had worked to build. This wasn't the standard he had fought to uphold. The flight continued, the tension thickening with each passing moment. Lisa avoided Camille's row now, delegating the interactions to the younger flight attendant. Camille, for her part, remained composed, though the storm within her was growing. She could feel the familiar churn of anger. Not the loud, explosive kind, but the quiet, steady burn that built over years of small injustices. When the meal trays were collected, Camille spoke up again. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of her resolve. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Lisa directly as she passed. Lisa stopped, her body stiffening. "Yes, ma'am? I'd like to understand something," Camille said. Her tone was gentle, but the words were a challenge. "From the moment I boarded this plane, I felt a distinct difference in how I've been treated compared to the other passengers." "Why is that?" Lisa hesitated, her professional mask slipping slightly. "I'm sorry you feel that way, ma'am," she said, defaulting to the same hollow phrase she had used earlier. Camille didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking for an explanation." For a moment, the two women stared at each other, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, Lisa spoke, her voice defensive. "I assure you, we're treating all passengers equally." Camille tilted her head, her gaze unyielding. "Then why does it feel so unequal?" Lisa said nothing, her jaw tightening. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her steps quick and clipped. Camille watched her go, her heart steady but her resolve stronger than ever. She had planted the seed of discomfort, and she knew it would grow. In the galley, Lisa and Jeff whispered again, their voices carrying just enough for Camille to catch fragments. "She's making this a bigger deal than it is," Lisa muttered, her frustration palpable. Jeff sighed, "Just keep your head down and finish the service." But Camille wasn't finished. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the name she needed, Daniel Johnson. Her husband and a senior board member of the airline. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a moment before she pressed it. The conversation was brief. Camille relayed the events without embellishment. Her voice calm but firm. Daniel listened intently, his tone growing sharper with each question he asked. "I'll handle it," he said finally. "But are you okay?" "I'm fine," Camille replied. "I just wanted addressed." When the call ended, Camille felt a small surge of relief. Not because the situation was resolved, but because she had taken the first step. She wasn't waiting for change, she was demanding it. Back in economy, Raymond Carter's phone buzzed softly in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, his eyebrows lifting slightly when he saw the name, Daniel Johnson. He answered immediately, his voice steady. "Daniel," he said, "what's going on?" As Daniel recounted Camille's experience, Raymond's expression darkened. By the time the call ended, he had made up his mind. He rose from his seat and pressed the call button above his head. The young flight attendant appeared, her eyes widening slightly when she recognized him. "How can I help you, sir?" she asked nervously. Raymond's voice was calm but firm. "Please inform the senior flight attendant that I'd like to speak with her immediately." The tension in the cabin was about to reach its breaking point. The tension in the cabin, so long simmering just beneath the surface, now felt like a live wire stretched taut. Camille Johnson sat in quiet poise, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm but unyielding. Around her, the hum of first-class comfort continued, a facade of tranquility barely masking the undercurrents of discomfort. It was a scene she had lived through in countless forms, the calm veneer of professionalism concealing the storm of subtle exclusion. In the galley, Lisa Marlowe was pacing now, her polished composure crumbling at the edges. Jeff Wallace leaned against the counter, his arms folded, his expression a mix of irritation and fatigue. Lisa's words spilled out in rapid bursts, her voice pitched low but sharp. "She's making a scene," Lisa said, her hands fluttering like restless birds. "I've done nothing wrong, but she keeps pushing." Jeff sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Lisa, this isn't the hill to die on. Just apologize and move on." Lisa's jaw tightened. "Why should I? I've been professional the entire time. She's the one creating the problem." Unbeknownst to them, their conversation had a silent witness. Raymond Carter, the airline's CEO, stood just outside the galley, his unassuming presence cloaked in the anonymity of economy class. He had heard enough. Straightening his blazer, he stepped into view, his calm but commanding demeanor silencing the flight attendants instantly. "Ms. Marlowe," Raymond said, his voice even but laced with authority. "A word, please." Lisa turned sharply, her face pale as she recognized him. Her carefully curated mask of professionalism faltered, and she glanced nervously at Jeff before stepping forward. "Mr. Carter," she stammered, her voice trembling slightly. "I wasn't aware you were on this flight." "That's the point," Raymond replied, his tone measured. "I like to observe my employees as they are, not as they perform when they know I'm watching." Lisa's face flushed, but she remained silent, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I'd like you to explain," Raymond continued, his voice calm but firm. "Why a first-class passenger, someone who paid for a premium experience, is sitting in her seat right now, questioning whether she's being treated equally." Lisa blinked, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. She began, but Raymond raised a hand, silencing her. "I don't need excuses," he said sharply. "What I need is accountability." Back in first class, Camille noticed the sudden stillness in the cabin. The younger flight attendant, her nervous hands now clutching a notepad, approached her row cautiously. "Ms. Johnson," she said hesitantly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. "The CEO would like to speak with you." Camille raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but curious. "The CEO?" "Yes," the attendant said quickly. "He's asked for you to meet him in the galley." Camille nodded, her movements deliberate as she rose from her seat. She walked down the aisle with quiet dignity, aware of the eyes that followed her. Passengers turned in their seats, their curiosity palpable, but Camille ignored them. This moment wasn't about their intrigue, it was about her resolve. The galley felt cramped, the tension thick enough to taste. Raymond stood with Lisa and Jeff, his sharp gaze fixed on the flight attendants. When Camille entered, he turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Ms. Johnson," Raymond said, inclining his head, "thank you for joining us." Camille nodded, her eyes briefly meeting his before flicking to Lisa. The flight attendant stood stiffly, her arms crossed, her gaze darting between Camille and Raymond. I wanted to personally apologize for the treatment you've received on this flight. Raymond said, I've been observing, and it's clear to me that you've been subjected to behavior that falls far below our standards. Camille regarded him carefully. I appreciate your acknowledgement, she said evenly, but words alone don't address the issue. Agreed, Raymond replied, his tone firm. He turned to Lisa and Jeff. This is where accountability comes in. Lisa's cheeks flushed, but she remained silent. Jeff shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the floor. Ms. Marlowe, Raymond continued, his voice sharp now. I've heard enough excuses. I want you to explain to Ms. Johnson and to me why your behavior has been so markedly different when serving her compared to the other passengers in first class. Lisa's lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. She started, then faltered. I didn't mean. Raymond cut her off. Intentions mean nothing when the impact is harm. Do you understand that? Lisa nodded weakly, her eyes downcast. Yes, sir. Camille watched the exchange with a quiet intensity. She wasn't here to humiliate Lisa, but she also wouldn't allow her behavior to be dismissed as a misunderstanding. Too often, she thought, these moments ended in deflection and hollow apologies. Not this time. I hope this is a learning moment for you, Camille said, her voice calm but firm. Because this isn't just about me. It's about a system that allows people like me to be treated as though we don't belong. Raymond nodded, his expression serious. Ms. Johnson, I want to assure you that this won't be swept under the rug. We'll be conducting a full review of our training programs and policies to ensure that this kind of behavior is not just addressed but prevented in the future. Camille inclined her head. Thank you, she said simply. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. Raymond turned to Lisa and Jeff, his tone final, effective immediately. You are relieved of your duties. Someone will meet you upon landing to discuss your termination. Lisa's face turned white, and Jeff's jaw tightened, but neither argued. They had seen the writing on the wall. As Camille returned to her seat, the cabin felt lighter, though the echoes of what had transpired still lingered. The passengers who had watched her with curiosity now looked at her with a mix of respect and discomfort. Camille didn't meet their gazes. This moment wasn't about them, it was about claiming her space, her dignity, and her right to be treated as an equal. Outside, the clouds rolled by, serene and untouchable. For the first time on this flight, Camille felt a flicker of peace. She wasn't naive, she knew this wasn't the end of the fight. But for now, it was enough to know that she had stood her ground and made her voice heard. The breaking point had come, and Camille had refused to be broken. The cabin, though quiet, was charged with a tension that rippled just beneath its surface. The polished veneer of first-class elegance had cracked, and what lay underneath was unmistakable, a collision of entitlement, bias, and the quiet strength of a woman unwilling to shrink. Camille Johnson sat upright in her seat, her fingers resting lightly on her lap, her calm exterior masking the storm of reflection and resolve churning inside her. She had not asked for this fight, but it had found her nonetheless. It always did. The aftermath of the confrontation in the galley lingered like a faint echo. Lisa Marlowe and Jeff Wallace had retreated, their absence a glaring admission of failure. The younger flight attendant had resumed service with an air of cautious professionalism, her every movement a deliberate attempt to mend what had been broken. Passengers shifted in their seats, their curiosity palpable but unspoken. Camille could feel their eyes on her, their thoughts like whispers she didn't need to hear to understand. Some looked at her with newfound respect, others with discomfort. She had disrupted their carefully curated world, a world where prejudice, if acknowledged at all, was always someone else's problem. The next ripple came not from a word, but from a gesture. The man across the aisle, the one who had earlier offered her an apologetic nod, leaned forward. His salt and pepper hair caught the cabin lights as he cleared his throat softly. Ms. Johnson, he said, his voice low but steady. I just wanted to say you handled that with remarkable grace. Camille turned to him, her expression measured. Thank you, she said. There was no anger in her tone, but neither was there warmth. She had heard similar words before, often from those who had stood silently by, watching but never intervening. I hope you don't think we're all like that, he continued, his words faltering slightly under her steady gaze. Some of us, we're trying to do better. Camille allowed a faint smile to touch her lips. But it didn't reach her eyes. Trying is a start, she said, but it's not enough. The man nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze turning toward the window. Camille turned away as well, her attention returning to the faint hum of the engines, the clouds rolling by like silent witnesses. In the galley, Raymond Carter stood with his arms crossed, his sharp eyes fixed on the younger flight attendant. "How's the cabin now?" he asked, his tone even but firm. She hesitated before answering. "Better, sir. I think everyone settled down." Raymond nodded, but his expression remained serious. He glanced down the aisle toward first class, where Camille sat, her profile calm but resolute. "It shouldn't have come to this," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "No, sir," the attendant agreed, her voice soft. "It shouldn't have." Raymond sighed, straightening his blazer. "I want every crew member debriefed after this flight. And I want a full report on what went wrong." "Yes, sir." As the attendant hurried off, Raymond lingered in the galley, his mind racing. He had built his airline on the promise of excellence, on the belief that every passenger deserved dignity and respect. And yet, here he was, confronting the stark reality that even the best intentions couldn't prevent prejudice from seeping into the cracks. Back in first class, Camille closed her eyes briefly, letting the rhythmic thrum of the engines ground her. She thought of her parents, who had taught her to stand tall even when the world tried to push her down. She thought of her daughter, a bright and curious teenager, who would one day face the same battles Camille had fought her entire life. The thought steadied her. She had endured this not just for herself, but for those who would come after her, for those who would walk into rooms, board planes, or sit at tables where their presence was questioned before their worth was seen. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to the destination. The passengers stirred, gathering their belongings and preparing for landing. Camille remained still, her gaze fixed on the window. The city below sparkled against the encroaching dusk, a patchwork of lights that seemed both close and impossibly far away. A shadow fell across her tray table, and she turned to see Raymond standing beside her row. His expression was thoughtful, his presence commanding but not overbearing. "Ms. Johnson," he said, inclining his head. "May I sit?" Camille gestured to the empty seat beside her. "Of course." Raymond lowered himself into the seat, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "I wanted to thank you," he began, "for your patience and for your courage. What you did today wasn't easy." "No," Camille agreed, her tone steady, "but it was necessary." Raymond nodded. "It was. And I want you to know that I take full responsibility for what happened. This wasn't just a failure of two individuals, it was a failure of the system I put in place." Camille studied him for a moment, her gaze searching. "And what will you do about it?" "I'll start by listening," Raymond said. "To you, to my staff, to every passenger who's felt unseen or unwelcome. And then I'll act on training, on accountability, on creating a culture where this doesn't happen again." Camille tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. "It's a good start," she said, "but change takes more than promises. It takes persistence." "You're right," Raymond replied, "and I'm prepared to persist." For the first time, Camille allowed herself to relax slightly. She wasn't naive, she knew that change wouldn't come easily. And it wouldn't come overnight. But in this moment, she felt a glimmer of hope. As the plane touched down, the cabin was filled with a soft rumble of wheels against the runway. Camille felt the weight of the day begin to lift, replaced by a quiet determination. The fight wasn't over, not for her, and not for the world she wanted to help shape. But it was a fight she was ready to continue. As the passengers disembarked, Raymond stood at the door, his presence a quiet assurance that the events of this flight would not be forgotten. When Camille passed him, he extended a hand. "Thank you, Ms. Johnson," he said, "for reminding us all what accountability looks like." Camille shook his hand, her grip firm. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she replied, "for showing that it's possible." And with that, she stepped into the terminal, her footsteps steady, her resolve unshaken. The airport terminal was a vast, polished expanse of movement and noise, a stark contrast to the tightly wound stillness Camille Johnson had endured during the flight. As she stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge, the air felt cooler, lighter, Yet the weight of the day lingered like a shadow. She walked with purpose, her carry-on rolling softly behind her. Her heels struck the tiled floor in a steady rhythm, each step an assertion of resolve. Around her, fellow passengers drifted off toward baggage claim, their murmured conversations punctuating the air. Camille caught fragments of their words, but she didn't linger on them. She had spent enough time in their gaze. Behind her, Raymond Carter lingered near the gate, his mind racing. The flight had revealed fractures in his airline's carefully maintained image, fractures that couldn't be ignored. His reputation as a leader had been built on a promise of equality and service. But today, he had witnessed the silent weight of prejudice within his own ranks. He had seen how it seeped into interactions, not with blatant hostility but with quiet indifference, the kind that wounds without ever drawing blood. Raymond straightened his blazer and turned to the young flight attendant who stood nervously beside him. "I need a report on everything that happened today," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "And I want recommendations for immediate action. This cannot happen again." The attendant nodded quickly, her hands clutching a notepad. "Yes, sir." Camille moved through the terminal, her eyes scanning the bustling space. People were everywhere, families reuniting, business travelers checking their phones, staff darting between gates. It was a familiar scene, yet Camille felt apart from it. The flight had left her with a simmering exhaustion, not just physical but emotional. She had stood her ground, spoken her truth, but the fight had drained her in ways she couldn't yet articulate. She stopped at a coffee stand, the line long but orderly. The barista, a young woman with a bright smile, greeted her warmly when it was her turn. Camille ordered a tea, her voice steady despite the churn of her thoughts. As she waited for her drink, a man approached her, salt and pepper hair, tailored blazer, the passenger from across the aisle. He hesitated before speaking, his expression a mix of respect and discomfort. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice soft but earnest. "I just wanted to say, you were remarkable today." Camille turned to him, her gaze steady. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded, shifting awkwardly. "I've seen moments like that before. But I didn't know what to do. Watching you, how you handled it made me realize how much I still have to learn." Camille studied him for a moment, weighing his words. She saw sincerity in his eyes but also a familiar hesitation, the kind that often accompanied good intentions unaccompanied by action. "Learning is a start," she said finally. "But what matters is what you do with it." He nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said. "I'll do better." Camille offered a faint smile. "I hope so." As she left the coffee stand, Camille's phone buzzed softly in her bag. She pulled it out, seeing her husband Daniel's name on the screen. Answering the call, she heard his steady, familiar voice. "Camille," he said, "I just spoke with Raymond. He's impressed with how you handled things." Camille let out a soft breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I'm glad," she said, "but it's not just about handling things. It's about what happens next." "I know," Daniel replied. "He's serious about making changes. He's already drafting a plan for retraining and oversight." "It's a start," Camille said, echoing her earlier words. "But this can't just be about one incident. It has to be about the culture." "It will be," Daniel assured her. "He knows how much is at stake." Camille nodded, though he couldn't see her. "I'll hold him to that." Meanwhile, Raymond stood at the airline's customer service desk, speaking quietly with a supervisor. His tone was calm but insistent as he outlined his expectations for the post-flight debrief. The staff listened attentively, their pens moving quickly across notepads. As he walked away, Raymond felt the weight of the day settling deeper into his chest. He had seen prejudice before, in boardrooms, in hiring decisions, in the subtle dynamics of power and privilege. But witnessing it unfold in real time, against a woman who had done nothing to invite it except exist in a space where she wasn't expected, had hit him differently. Camille reached the curb outside the terminal, the evening air cool against her skin. A sleek black sedan pulled up, the driver stepping out to open the door for her. She thanked him softly and settled into the backseat, the quiet hum of the car a welcome reprieve. As the city skyline came into view, Camille let her mind drift. She thought about the countless moments like this one, the small battles fought in spaces where she was made to feel like an outsider. She thought about the passengers who had watched her, their silence a reminder of how often people chose comfort over confrontation. But she also thought about Raymond, about his willingness to listen, to act. It wasn't everything, but it was something. A crack in the armor of indifference. The car pulled up to her hotel, and Camille stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She walked through the lobby, her posture straight, her presence commanding. The staff greeted her warmly, their smiles genuine, but Camille felt no need to reciprocate. The weight of the day was still with her, and she carried it like a stone in her chest. In her room, she set down her bag and walked to the window, the city lights sprawling before her. She sipped her tea, the warmth grounding her, and let herself exhale fully for the first time that day. She thought about her daughter, about the world she hoped to leave her, a world where dignity wasn't something to be fought for, but something freely given. And she thought about the work ahead, the long road toward change. Camille didn't feel triumphant, but she felt resolved. She had spoken her truth, and it had been heard. Now, it was up to the world to respond. The shadows of the day lingered, but in the distance, there was light. The early evening light cast long shadows across the city streets as Camille Johnson exited the hotel. She walked with quiet determination, her steps deliberate, her mind still replaying the events of the day. The memory of the flight, its challenges, confrontations, and quiet reckonings lingered like an unresolved melody. She carried it with her, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Raymond Carter sat in his office later that night, the events of the day weighing heavily on him. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the city outside. On his desk, a stack of reports waited for his attention, but his focus was on the memo he was drafting, a directive to his executive team that would set the tone for the airline's future. The words came slowly at first, but with each sentence, Raymond's purpose sharpened. He wrote about accountability, about the need for training that went beyond surface-level gestures, and about creating a culture where every passenger, regardless of race or background, felt valued and respected. When he finished, he sat back and read the memo aloud, his voice steady but resolute. The words were simple, but they carried weight. He pressed send, knowing that this was only the beginning. The next morning, Camille woke to a series of notifications on her phone. Messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers flooded her inbox. Word of the incident had spread, and while some messages were filled with support, others carried the weight of skepticism or outright dismissal. Camille scrolled through the messages, her expression unreadable. She had anticipated the backlash. It always came when someone dared to challenge the status quo. But she also saw hope in the voices of those who thanked her for speaking out, for standing firm. They reminded her that she wasn't alone in this fight. At the airport, Raymond met with his team, their faces a mix of apprehension and determination. He outlined the new measures he wanted implemented: mandatory inclusivity training, anonymous reporting channels for passengers and staff, and a commitment to hiring leaders who reflected the diversity of their customers. Change isn't easy, Raymond said, his voice firm, but it's necessary, and it starts here. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then, one by one, his team nodded, their resolve matching his own. Later that day, Camille boarded her return flight. She moved through the terminal with the same poise she always carried. But this time, something felt different. Passengers and staff alike seemed more aware, their interactions tinged with a faint hesitance, as though they were grappling with the weight of what had happened. When she reached her seat, a flight attendant approached her, a young man with a nervous smile and an air of earnestness. "Ms. Johnson," he said softly, "I wanted to personally welcome you aboard. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let me know." Camille studied him for a moment before offering a small nod. "Thank you," she said, her tone polite but measured. As the flight took off, Camille gazed out the window at the clouds rolling by. The challenges she had faced weren't new, and she knew they wouldn't disappear overnight. But she also knew that change, however slow, had begun. In the days that followed, Raymond's memo sparked conversations across the airline and beyond. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a turning point in the industry's approach to inclusivity. Some praised the steps being taken, others questioned whether they would be enough. For Camille, the attention was both validating and exhausting. She hadn't sought the spotlight, but she understood its power. She used her platform to speak not just about her experience, but about the larger systems that allowed such incidents to persist. Change isn't about one person or one moment. she said during an interview. It's about the choices we make every day to challenge injustice. To stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. Months later, Camille and Raymond crossed paths again at a corporate event. Their eyes met across the room, and Raymond approached her with a smile. "Ms. Johnson," he said, extending his hand, "it's good to see you." "And you," Camille replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I wanted to thank you again," Raymond said, "not just for what you did that day, but for what it's led to. Your courage forced us to confront things we had been ignoring for too long." Camille nodded. "I appreciate that," she said, "but remember, this isn't the end. It's just the beginning." Raymond smiled, his expression thoughtful. "Agreed." As Camille left the event, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The fight was far from over, but progress had been made. She thought of her daughter, of the world she hoped to leave her, a world where moments like the one she had faced on that flight were no longer possible. The city lights stretched out before her, a testament to resilience and hope. Camille walked toward them, her footsteps steady, her resolve unshaken. The journey toward justice was long, but it was one she was determined to see through.